Good morning, good morning. Welcome to the opening session of the opening day of our 11th annual policy orientation for the Texas Legislature. We are so glad to have you here, our friends and allies of the movement for liberty in Texas and across our nation. Many of you have been here before, and for those of you who have not, you're here for the first time, you're in for a treat. This year, we have more registered attendees than last year, and this year we have added a third day. This new third day, which you're joining us for now, is dedicated entirely to media and the conservative movement. So why are we, a state-based policy think tank, doing a full day on the media? The answer lies in our nature as an organization dedicated to effective action and real results. Too often, policy institutions such as ours are perceived as little more than academic departments dedicated to churning out studies, white papers, prescriptions with no connection to real policy making or real people. That isn't us. That has never been us. From the beginning, Texas Public Policy Foundation has maintained a sharp focus on translating principles into policy. If you're a friend of liberty in Texas, you take heart in our work that often ends up enacted for the betterment of Texas. And if you're a friend of big government in Texas, perhaps we cause you a bit of concern from time to time. Either way is a compliment in our book. Policy making, though, is not just a matter of legislative contacts and executive fiat. Our democratic process is one of reason, of dialogue, and persuasion. Lyndon Baines Johnson was fond of quoting the book of Isaiah, "Come, let us reason together." And though he managed to reach the wrong policy conclusions remarkably often, his invocation of the fundamental spirit of our democratic public square was entirely correct. That process of reason, of debate, and of persuasion is continually underway in private and in public, in our family living rooms, in local bars, gatherings of friends, to churches, to VFW halls, to right here at this policy orientation. And it continually is shaped, informed, and revised in what we call our media. For those of us who wish to advance an agenda of freedom, and for any of us wishing to affect public policy, the question isn't whether we ought to engage in media, it's how. There's a great American conversation out there, and we must be a part of it. At the Texas Public Policy Foundation, I'm proud to say that we have undergone a bit of a revolution in media affairs in the past 2 years. Starting in 2011, we dramatically expanded our operations beyond the well-traveled paths of the State Capitol Press Corps. The lessons of Texas are applicable nationally and indeed internationally, and we decided to make sure that they saw dissemination in the wider world. The result? Well, we quadrupled our audience, quadrupled our engagement in print, radio, and television, entered into a series of path-breaking national radio partnerships, saw ourselves in international press for the first time, and even wrote, shot, and aired our first ever television commercials. You've probably never heard of Lieutenant Colonel John Boyd. He was in the Air Force, and unless you have a military background, you've probably not heard of him. But he was one of the master strategists of the last half century and a major influence on war, business, and communication today. And one of the key questions he posed to those seeking his counsel was this: do you want to be somebody or do something? As the Texas Public Policy Foundation, we're not out there for the accolades or for the eminence. We want to do something. That's why we exist. And that's why we're hosting this media day. Because in the end, we must win an argument with the people of Texas and with the people of America before we win the argument with their elected representatives. I don't need to tell you that how much the movement for liberty needs this lesson reiterated after the past election year. The bad news is that we lost the game to the other side when it counted. The good news is we get another shot at that goal because the debate and the conversation goes on. And the best news, we can and we will win. At this first media day at the 11th policy orientation, it is just the first step toward that victory. And so we thank you for joining us. Now I would like to ask Josh Trevino, our Vice President for External Relations, and the man responsible for much of our media success, to come introduce our first guest.
Thanks, Arlene. Thank you all for attending. Just to emphasize what Arlene said, thank you all for attending our first Media Day. This 11th policy orientation is something of a landmark for us for all the reasons that she said. I will briefly introduce myself, and then I'll introduce our first panelist, who we're very privileged to have with us. My name is Joshua Trevino. I am the Vice President for External Relations at the Texas Public Policy Foundation. I am a person of no special consequence. Do not Google me, because it gets very unpleasant shortly thereafter. However, I am mildly qualified to be your host for at least 3 or 4 of the panels today. Mike Joyce looks a bit alarmed that I don't know if it's 3 or 4, but I'm not sure if we count the takeaway broadcast as a panel. Nevertheless, over the course of the day, you will see me having conversations with many of the smarter people of the world, of whom Erica Greeter is the first. Ben Domenech will be next, and then later on you'll see me at the takeaway, and finally with Jonah Goldberg in the afternoon. But enough about me. Let's talk about what you think of me. A short while ago, how long have you been doing this, writing the book?
Since fall of last year, no, of 2011.
Fall of 2011.
Yes, and I just finished proofreading it yesterday morning, so.
Sometime in the past 18 months, someone whose identity will come as no surprise to you wrote the following, and I think it's just such a delightful passage, I'm going to share it with you. You still must buy the book. This is a mere 0.5% of its genius text. Quote, perhaps the reason Texas eccentricities excite so much suspicion is that Texans themselves are so belligerently proud of the state. It's a court that has annoyed outsiders since the frontier days. An early visitor from France, for example, once noted that the defenders of the Alamo included, quote, the man who invented that deadly weapon, the Bowie knife, which is the tenet of every Texan's bosom and which should be deposited dripping with human blood in the museums of Europe and placed by the side of the weapons of the benighted Indian of the desert as an emblem of the savage barbarism of the Anglo-American race. I heard a similar view, end quote. I heard a similar view expressed more recently by a friend who had been turned away while trying to buy a 6-pack of beer. His driver's license was not issued in Texas, and so the clerk did not have to accept it. Most states have similar laws, but Texas is the only one where a liquor store clerk would stand on principle. This exceptional and very apt observation on Texas and the Texans comes from none other than our first panelist, Erica Greeter. We are so privileged to have her here, not least because this is your first event talking about the book, is it not?
My first, yeah.
Your very first. Well, hopefully it's all downhill from here. Erica is a senior politics editor, I believe, at Texas Monthly, formerly of The Economist, a San Antonio native, and well qualified to observe Texas and Texans. I must say, Erica, I've been reading your coverage of Texas for the past several years, starting in The Economist, and one of the things that especially commends you to me and to us here is, although I don't always agree with you, you're consistently one of the smartest people writing on the state, and very glad to have you here. And please join me in welcoming Erica Greeter to this panel today. Her forthcoming book, to be released on Shakespeare's birthday, which I'm sure you all know is April 23rd, is called what?
Big, Hot, Cheap, and Right.
Big, Hot, Cheap, and Right, about the state of Texas and what it can teach the United States. Tell us about the thesis of the book, and let's get into what specifically it's arguing.
Well, great. Well, thanks. First of all, I'd like to say thanks for being here for my first book talk. We'll see how this goes. Josh, thanks for having me. I feel really happy to be on stage with Josh, but kind of worried because I've noticed that Josh is somebody with probably the most in-depth knowledge of Texas history that you find in a general practitioner. So any factual questions that...
Please elaborate on that point.
I mean, you can ask Josh for who said what comment in what debate in 1880, and he'll know off the top of his head. And any errors in the book are things that I probably should have asked Josh about first, so he could have caught them. But the book I wanted to write was, during the downturn, and this kind of came to a head when Perry got in the presidential race, I had noticed the discrepancy between what I was writing about the state and what I was reading about the country in the first place, and secondly, what I was thinking about the state, how I felt living in the state, and what people thought about the state from the outside. It seems like we in the state who live here have a sense of how good it is to live here, some of the things we enjoy that a lot of states didn't enjoy in the past 4 or 5 years. But at the same time, there's this outsider's view that the state is just the worst state in the country, despite having states like New Jersey and Florida in the country. So I thought that the moment would be good to write a book saying, this is why the state is the way it is, this is what works about it, this is how it is, and this is how it came to be this way. So I think that context helps all of us understand the state a little better, whether or not we would pursue the same set of goals.
The title, of course, being Big, Hot, Cheap, and Right. Big, hot, and cheap, I think we all readily apprehend, but what's right about Texas? And to be clear, your work is analytic. It's not a work of boosterism. It's a serious analysis of the state, and there are some very trenchant critiques of how Texas is run. But let's start with what's going right, and we'll move into what could be better.
Okay, great. Well, the right part of the title is meant to be some wordplay. I mean, it refers, of course, to the fact this is the biggest red state or Republican state in the country and the most influential by far. But it also means that the state is getting a lot of things right. I think that the facts we heard about the Texas miracle were broadly correct. I mean, we've seen a state that's creating jobs at a much greater rate than any other state in the country. That's creating almost half of the country's jobs by itself. It's a state where median household income is about the national average, but for cost of living adjustments is higher than the national average. The jobs we're creating are broad-based. There's a lot of low-wage jobs, but about 2/3, 3/4 are in the medium and higher wage sectors. And it's a state where people are voting with their feet, as we keep saying, and I'm sure you'll hear many times in the next few days, and has posted huge population growth over the past 10 years, but also going back farther than that. So on that kind of indicator, we see people moving to the state for the very credible reason that it's a good place to work and to live and to raise a family and so on.
But now the population growth that you cite as evidence that Texas is working right, some of the most sterling minds of our era, including Kevin Drum and Paul Krugman, have said that the population growth is almost wholly explicable by the fact that it is cheap and the weather is so wonderful here.
That thing about the weather, that was a Krugman comment, and I just...
It was a Drum comment as well.
It was Drum also? Yeah,
Oh,
I
yes.
think Drum, yeah, he did reiterate that. You're right. I just find that baffling. I don't think anyone moves here for the weather. I certainly didn't. But maybe you guys did. The cheap aspect, I mean, it's true that it's, if you're living in New York and you're working there and then you have a kid and you want to buy a house and have a yard, you might look for cities that don't have the same cost of living. But I don't think anyone's moving to the state because it's cheap. If that was true, we'd all be moving to South Dakota or North Dakota. You can get free land there under homestead policies.
Really?
Yes. You've got to stay for 5 years, and they warn you on the state site, like, it's really cold here, it's a tough life, you've got to be really committed to North Dakota to come here, but it's still true. It's
sort of like moving to Cuba as a 16th century Spaniard. You've got to commit. Interesting. I did not know that.
Don't leave, though.
No, don't worry.
It's still not worth it.
Party at my place in South Dakota. But now you and now typically when people have gone on the internet and looked at past stuff that I've written, it's been the prelude to something awful. But I've done it to you nonetheless, and pulled up a lot of your columns from The Economist in 2011 because I think I'm interested in the evolution of your thought and to what extent you agree or disagree with yourself in this. But in 2011, when The Economist, like almost every other major publication in the world, suddenly became keenly interested in Texas for the 20 minutes that it looked like Rick Perry was going to be the next president. One of the things that you wrote, which has some concurrence with many of the what I'll call the mainstream media critics. I mean, you wrote for The Economist, no offense, but You're part of that.
I am part of the mainstream media.
You wrote in mid-2011, the much vaunted Texas miracle cannot be easily replicated. I want to press you a bit on that point because
Sure.
you seem to, and correct me if I'm misreading the book, but you seem to not necessarily agree with that point in the book. I mean, you draw the connection, which I agree with and the Foundation agrees with, that what's right about Texas is really what's traditionally right about the United States. Is the Texas miracle replicable, exportable, and to add a third question into the one, is it unique to Texas?
Well, I think what I would say with this is I think the Texas miracle is largely based on the Texas model, which we all are familiar with. Basically, it's a low tax, low services state. It's a model that emphasizes openness, accessibility, maybe transparency, ease of access, but doesn't focus so much on a safety net or extraneous structures like that. I think that's worked really well for Texas for a variety of reasons: historical, cultural, economic, and demographic. And parts of the model can't be replicated elsewhere. So things like, we have a young population, that's an asset for the state. A lot of states don't have that. We have natural resources that are no longer as dominant in the economy as they once were, but are nonetheless a big part of the economy. A lot of states don't have that. We have access to incredible trade corridors in both across the border to the south, but also via the ports. A lot of states are landlocked and don't have that kind of access. So I guess my comment that you pulled out is meant to say it would be reductive to say any state can just do this by adopting the Texas model wholesale. I think other states have to look at their own assets, their own liabilities, and figure out what works best for them based on that. And from a more prescriptive point of view, I'm happy for states to have different models. I don't think that the Texas model is the correct model for every state or the ideal for every state. I think you have to judge that based on what your state or your region looks like.
Let me push back a little bit on that, though,
Sure.
Specifically with regard to two things: the young population, which I think you have a valid point there. There are a lot in the Western world in general, and certainly in the United States. There are a lot of aging populations, and where you have a comparatively young population, it tends to be states with lots of immigrants, which Texas is. However, Texas is not, as you know, the only state with lots of immigrants. You've got places like California and certainly New York and almost any of the major urban areas, Florida, Chicago, places like that, which don't perform as well. That's one counterpoint. The other, on the natural resources, and this is something that I know you're well practiced in pairing this from your colleagues, but one does get the critique of Texas. Well, Texas is a petrostate. It's basically Bahrain on the desert. Bahrain without the Shiites, right? So it's oil fueled, and so there's nothing about Texas that can't be replicated without several million years worth of petroleum in the ground. But when you look at the state gross, gross state product, energy accounts for varying between 8 and 11%. Probably going to go down actually as the natural gas glut hits. But in terms of jobs, you're talking maybe 2 to 3% of
Right. Texas
jobs.
Right.
I mean, you much more in manufacturing and services. So I mean, are these unreplicable things really that unreplicable? When I look back on Texas history, there's very clear understanding, especially in the generation of the Revolution, that Texas is an American project.
Right.
Travis's famous letter from the Alamo, to the people of Texas and all the Americans in the world. And then he actually ends by, urging an American jihad against Mexico, justly, may I add. So this, what are your thoughts on that?
I think that's a good point to bring out about the energy industry. When Perry got in the race, there was so much focus on this so-called miracle and the job numbers themselves, and there was a lot of questioning about whether the job numbers could even be real. With regard to energy, as you say, it's a capital-intensive industry rather than labor-intensive. I think the number of jobs added in the energy industry, in mining and extraction too, are maybe 2% in the past year of the total net jobs. They're fairly high-paid jobs, but they're not the bulk of the jobs we have. The overall economic impact is bigger because it's capital-intensive. And I do find that line of critique pretty strange in itself because, yes, we have a lot of oil wealth. Maryland benefits from having the federal government right there next to it, so you have a lot of federal government job wealth created in Maryland. Or Massachusetts has a lot of universities founded 400 years ago that create a lot of knowledge job wealth. So every state has these advantages. But nonetheless, I guess that means, replicable, you could say, look at your advantages and replicate based on that, but I think the particular components of this state's approach aren't observed everywhere.
Can we talk, do you mind speaking a bit about a bit about the uniqueness, and then I want to segue into the other part of your thesis on what Texas is not doing right in your book, but can you tell us in a thumbnail what the uniquely Texan things are that will stay in Texas forever? About the Texas mind and spirit, perhaps.
Well, I think you said in the previous question that the state is in some ways an exaggeration of the American project, or kind of a very intense iteration of a lot of American ideals. I think that's been true historically in a way that is going to persist. You saw the state come out of the Civil War and Reconstruction with really no economy at all. Just kind of scraps and sort of small farms. And then for the next 30, 40 years, the stability of Texas was based on the cattle kingdom, which was short-lived but nonetheless very influential and created a lot of wealth where there had been none before, and then the discovery of oil in 1901 at Spindletop. So by the time we entered the 20th century, there was already this mindset, I think, established in Texas that business was the way for people to create opportunity and wealth and stability for themselves rather than government. As we went through the 20th century, that's when we saw more government intervention in Texas, more federal spending, more military contracting, and so on. But I think we'd already gone down the path of the state government will be small, we'll be skeptical of government as an alternative to the private sector, and we'll generally support the private sector as the way for us to make our way in the world. Beyond that, I would cite a couple of
Please.
Other small, unique things about the state. I think one thing that we tend to undervalue as an aspect of Texas is the fact that because we were a country before being annexed to the United States, that has a lot of psychological heft, obviously. It's part of why we're so proud of Texas all the time. But it also has some pragmatic import because it means we came to the country with laws that were inherited from Spanish and Mexican law, and which persisted once we were a state. So you see, for example, a focus on property rights that a lot of Western states in particular didn't have. You see a focus on women's economic rights. Women could own businesses in the Republic of Texas. That persisted when we were a state. That's, I think, one of the idiosyncrasies that's a little bit overlooked. And I think in the national context today, another idiosyncrasy for Texas is that more than the other big states, we've come sort of thundering forward from a low baseline. So we had the experience in the second half, really, of the 20th century of going from a poor state to a middle-income state and becoming a powerhouse that we are today. I think the experience of that is close enough to Texans that we still have it in mind as progress is possible and we're achieving it, year on year.
Well, that's exactly right. The comparative prosperity of Texas, certainly as a standout state in the United States, is very new. It's within the past generation.
Right.
Really not even that. You only have to go back to about 2002, 2003 to see Texas as one of many big states. So projecting forward, if I could ask you to prognosticate a bit, and I will get to the question about what Texas is doing wrong. How do you think this is going to change Texas as time passes?
It's funny how our historical memory is both really short and really long. I think that even though it's been quite recent that we've become a reasonably affluent state, maybe we haven't quite fully internalized the sense that we are now. I think what's changed in Texas is partly what's changed in the United States. We've seen kind of a structural shift in the economy because of globalization, where increasingly the jobs created in the United States are going to be knowledge jobs, highly skilled jobs, more highly paid jobs. And so for a state like Texas, which until recently was not a highly skilled state, was not a highly skilled workforce, and didn't need to be that because we were a resource state, and because we're also a very young state, the fact that we're now moving forward into a global context where we'll have to create more highly skilled jobs is going to be a thing we need to think about pretty actively, because we can't keep going on the current system of, we'll need to think about things like K-12 education, workforce training, community colleges, and higher education to prepare the workforce we have now for the jobs we're going to have 10, 20 years from now.
Perfect segue.
Okay.
What is not going right in the Texas model, according to you in your book?
Well, I think that it was actually pretty convenient in writing because I'm a political independent, and so I was worried that I would arrive at a conclusion looking at the history that would feel partisan to me because I'm not out to boost or to trash either side. But as it happened, I think the models worked out very well. I think it's still working in a lot of ways. But I think because of the extraneous factor I mentioned of economic change, and because of some internal changes too, like the youth of the state, we're going to have to think about changing the model a little bit going forward. I think that the areas we're always dinged for in the national press are factually valid, and we do have poor educational outcomes relative to most states. We have a very high poverty rate relative to most states. We have low rates of healthcare insurance. We have a lot of other social welfare problems, and we have problems with the criminal justice pipeline and that kind of thing. We're seeing progress on a lot of those metrics. I think actually in almost every metric we're seeing improvement. But we'll need to resist the tendency to be complacent because of how much progress we've made and continue to push forward perhaps a little more aggressively. I mean, the kind of response I think has been to those critiques has been, well, you know, we're not as bad as Mississippi, which is funny, but it's not funny when we're not being compared to that set of states anymore. We're now playing in the big leagues, nationally and internationally, and we need to be one of the top states in all of these model metrics.
Let's pretend I'm an office holder or policymaker,
Okay.
so I can enjoy that aura for a brief minute. If a staffer came to me and gave me this, exactly the analysis that you gave and said, you know, we're compared to Mississippi and our educational outcomes aren't that good, and we do have you know, objectively higher measures of poverty in the rest of the states. You know, my response would be to be absolutely blunt that that's not the entire picture. When you look at cost of living adjusted rates of poverty, for example, we're not better than Mississippi. We're better than California.
Yeah.
You know, California is the poverty king in the United States in terms of educational outcomes. You know, I would argue that if you are a Hispanic or an African American student, in a high school student in Texas, then you stand a greater chance of graduating from high school than your peers in the same ethnic group in almost any other state, excepting, I believe, North Dakota, actually. If you're African American in North Dakota, then you have it made in terms of high school graduations. So the outcomes, actually, in Texas, on education, when you look at ethnicity as a covariate, on poverty, when you adjust for cost of living, as you note, not only has there been progress, but by many measures, we're not at Mississippi level.
No.
Look, I don't know Mississippi that well, so if there are Mississippians in here, please forgive me. It's our next speaker, in fact, wonderful. Good. Yes, and you're Puerto Rican too,
And where do you live?
how do we complete the trifecta there? You know, so if I'm a politician and my imperative is to inertia, how do you respond?
No, it's totally true. I mentioned this in the book quite a bit. On the schools thing, actually, it's interesting. If you look at national test scores for fourth grade science and math and reading, Texas students on aggregate are about the same. They're about the middle of the pack. But if you break it down by ethnic cohort, Texas Anglo, Hispanic, and African American students are all in the top 10, often top 5, easily the top of the big states. So we are doing, I think, much better than people would think on things like that. Part of what I want to do in this book is explain the things that are better than people think. With all that said, though, I think the goal for us as a state is not just to beat California again. I mean, we've been doing that in a lot of ways. It's fine, but my goal as a citizen and as a person who plans to live here is not to be the best among states, it's to be good enough for Texas. And if we're the best state in the country, which I think we would all say, we want to have things that reflect well in us, not just that we're better than other states.
That's a terrifyingly well-honed election debate quip there. I admire quite a bit. But that's an excellent point. The metric of Texas is Texas, clearly, as rightly it ought to be. And yet, this is a point that you've made, and forgive me, I don't recall if you made this in the book, but you've made it in conversation several times, and I think it's such an interesting point. I want to bring it out. The median voter, the median public opinion in Texas, does Texas governance reflect, this is obviously a softball question since I'm phrasing it in this way, does Texas governance, since you've never thought about this before, Erica, does Texas governance reflect Texans at this point, or is there going to be a change in the coming decade that resets the ideological spectrum here?
After careful thought, I would say no. I would say, I think we've seen in the state a fairly consistent philosophical view on the part of the median voter or of the electorate averaged out, and that was true even when the state was a totally Democratic state in the way that it's now totally Republican. It's been a pretty straightforward, fiscally conservative, socially moderate, maybe center-right overall state. I think the state GOP has been that kind of party for a long time. I think in the past couple of years, even the last session, what we saw was because the party had gotten so big, there was this tendency for the election to move to the primary rather than the general election. So we got, a few, we got this shift farther right. So I think now the state party is a little bit farther right than where the center of the state is philosophically. And I think that is sustainable for the state party as long as the state keeps improving. Because in an election, voters are asking themselves, do I feel better than 4 years ago, as usual? So, and that's been true in Texas for a long time. Every 4 years we're getting better, we're feeling better, we're demonstrably are better. But I think there's going to be some point where some of the rhetoric, some of the more far-right policy initiatives could backfire. So we might see some moderates peeling away a little bit from the state Republican Party, giving a new look to Democrats, who in Texas are not really that far from the center either, unless the moderate GOP reasserts itself, which I think is possible.
On the partisan question, Texas, as you know, actually, and a lot of non-Texans are not aware of this, Texas actually has a higher rate of urbanization than the nation at large.
So 80%?
Not dramatically large. I think the national rate is around 80, and Texas is 82, 84, something like that. So just a tick upward. But Texans live within city limits. And when you talk about city and municipal government in Texas, the larger the city gets, and especially when you talk about the Big Five, Fort Worth, Dallas, Houston, San Antonio, and Austin, you're talking about Democrat-run cities.
Yes.
And so how does that fit into your analysis, first of all? And is it, if I could ask you to prognosticate, and I promise not to hold you to this in 2022 when we reconvene for the 10-year anniversary of your book, but is this a harbinger of the future, that Texas does go that way, which I'm sure many would take great joy in our city governments, or is it something that's going to remain confined to the urban cores for the remainder of time?
Well, I would push back a little bit by saying all these cities are Democratic, led by Democrats, but officially they're nonpartisan offices, the mayor's job. I don't think any of the Democrats in any of these cities are especially left-wing Democrats. I think they're all pretty centrist. I think that's even true of Julian Castro in San Antonio, who is the most prominent of these Democratic mayors. There still is a focus on economic development, on the business community. We're seeing them have concerns, we're seeing them advance concerns like education that Republican leaders are not doing this as much to advance. So I also would push back by saying that I don't think Texas urban politics are quite the same as, say, Chicago politics. They're not the same kinds of cities, they're not as dense. They don't feel as citified as New York or Philadelphia.
Houston having the largest land area of any city in the United States.
Right, so Houston's the biggest city in Texas, but you're still driving your car everywhere. They're getting a little more, pedestrian development, but it doesn't feel like a city in the way that, people conceive of urban centers quite yet. And then a third pushback point would be, I think Americans in general, and this is true in Texas, don't mind having divided layers of government. So you vote Democrat for governor, Republican for president, you have a mayor that doesn't match your governor ideologically. But as far as will the state turn blue, is that the question? And I appreciate you phrasing that question in a way that was not the way it's always phrased.
I try, thank you.
I've gotten really tired of that one.
It's not a fruitful question, but it is fruitful to ask whether these urban power bases, which, and to push back a tiny bit on pushback,
Sure.
Yes, nonpartisan offices, but nevertheless, definitively of a particular party and benefiting that party. And so, although I hasten to remind everyone here that we are a nonpartisan organization, but this is an interesting question about the future of Texas. And so I don't think you mean to imply this, but the parties, albeit shifted somewhat to the right on the broader American spectrum, they're not programmatically the same.
They're not quite
By
the
any
same,
stretch.
no.
Yes.
They have been They have been almost the same at various points, but they're not quite the same.
Well, I mean, yeah, obviously the Texas Democrats were going to run Ricardo Sanchez as a Senate candidate for a brief period. How are we on time, by the way? Are we good to go? We have some more time. Okay, very good. At any point, by the way, we are going to open up a formal Q&A process to the audience, because I think you all should take advantage of the opportunity to ask Erica any questions. And as she said, if I can provide the provenance of any quotes, I'm happy to do so offline. But so raise your hand, and we'll have somebody with a mic come to you. Who's this book for? Texans are sold on Texas. Who's your audience?
Well, I hope I hope Texans are sold on Texas, but maybe not the book yet. I hope Texans buy the book. It's also meant for a national audience, though, and a little bit international, too. I think there's a lot of international attention focused on the state. You see this sort of emotionally charged Freudian attraction / repulsion about Texas in some quarters. So my hope is that people can read this, and if not, come away thinking this is the best state ever, at least think, okay, this makes sense. This is not a approximate threat to how I see American values or how I see the country proceeding.
Obviously, you work for a UK publication. You went to school in the UK briefly, did you not? Or, no, but you work for UK. So tell us a bit more, because this is, Texans always want to hear what others think of them.
Yeah.
Can you give us some insight into more of the international perception of Texans? My experience, which may not be too different from yours, is that we're not far removed from cowboys and gunfighters in their mind.
Yes.
Can you elaborate upon that?
There is this kind of stereotype about Texans are always carrying a gun and they're riding horses to school, and beyond that kind of cartoon version of Texas, they have the idea this is a very right-wing, rabidly right-wing state. This is a state that's always sort of pushing its weight around within the country. I mean, of course, depending on which country you're in Britain, they see the U.S. as kind of like them, but a little bit farther to the right and a little bit more unpredictable, but ideally sort of like them still. I think, as we were saying before, that a lot of Americans see Texas the way a lot of Brits see the United States, which is kind of funny.
So it's sort of this Matryoshka doll of American belligerence that sort of unfolds,
Yes.
and it starts in Midland as the tiniest, and then goes out to Texas.
It's like this
and
angry core
America,
of America,
right.
yeah. Which I think, and there's kind of a rhetorical issue too, because I think Texans, I find this really charming. I mean, I like the way Texans talk about Texas, and I like how we're so kind of assertive and direct and forthright. And I think it's funny. And I don't find it menacing. But a lot of Americans, even especially Europeans, think it's just like belligerent and ugly and stupid and way too aggressive. You see that a lot with the secession comments. I mean, whenever there's a secession joke in Texas, I think we see it as a joke, and Americans see it as just like a really horrible thing to say. So.
And it's funny you bring that up, because, of course, secession recently back in the news since the presidential election, since the president was reelected. Of course, the White House, for those of you who are not familiar, has this absolutely ludicrous feature where you can go and create a petition to build a Death Star, or buy me a gallon of cheese or something like that. And so, and if you get 25,000 e-signatures on this whitehouse.gov petition, then the White House has obligated itself to respond to you. Now, typically you get an email that says no, right? But they will respond. And so after the election, can you walk us through this secession kerfuffle that occurred there, and how meaningful / meaningless it was?
Yeah. So the recent one was that within 24 hours of the election, I think probably about half the states. The states, I guess, actually probably about 30 states, including some states that went for Obama, had these petitions online saying our state wants to secede. Texas was either the first or one of the first to have the petition, and of course, because population numbers, we were the first to cross the threshold. That means the White House has to review this petition. So there was this kind of instant, and I never know how seriously to take this, because it seems like come on, seriously, but there was this kind of instant, of course, these guys are still talking about secession. They want to secede, and it's like, just think about the numbers. Like, I mean, we have 26 million people now. I mean,
well, thematically, it started in 2010, though. I mean, this is a continuing story in terms of Texas secession.
Oh, thematically, yeah.
Correct. Yeah, in major media.
Right. And one thing I thought was interesting about it, and this is maybe an area where we fail to perceive what people don't perceive about us is that I realized at some point in writing about the Perry comments, which I thought were funny and not serious, obviously.
The Perry Tea Party comments.
Yes, it was
yeah.
2009, I think, wasn't it?
You're right, it was 2009.
So I've written a story about it saying he was clearly joking, and an editor kind of put in a clause saying, but it was a very bad joke because of the painful history of the Confederacy and so on. And I hadn't realized to that point that people thought it was a Confederate thing. I mean, I think we talk about independence, secession, we always mean the independent country of Texas. It's always a reference to the Republic of Texas, not to the Confederacy. But I think people elsewhere thought we were talking about crypto-Confederate, fly the flag of Dixie stuff, which is not the case.
Right, well, I mean, except for deep behind the pine curtain somewhere in Van Zandt County.
Which I don't really go to, so.
Outside of that, and it's interesting that you say that, of course, because the actual history of secession in Texas, although Texas did secede, joined the Confederacy, and kind of traveled down that terrible path, Sam Houston, before he passed away in 62, I believe, 1862, was hatching plans for once the South won. He was going to have Texas secede from the Confederacy as well, and create, which it brings a tear to my eye, frankly, when I think about it. But
it's a really tragic story. I mean, I opened the book with Sam Houston because he was the only Southern governor who didn't want to secede, and he tried really hard to convince the state of that. The state ended up voting for it, but he stepped down rather than be the governor of the Confederate state of Texas.
Well, I mean, you deposed and replaced with the lieutenant governor, yeah.
Yeah, I mean, he spent his whole life fighting for Union, so.
Yeah, and there's a very tragic, which I'm sure you've come across, vignette of Houston in his final months in Galveston, I believe, lecturing Confederate volunteers, 17-year-old boys, about what to expect in war. This veteran of the Texas Revolution. In any case, I apologize. I will weep manly tears if we talk about Sam Houston any further. Please go ahead.
No, you finish that.
Oh, I'm done. Yes.
Well, I mean, so we don't weep any tears on stage. I think we can turn this back to the belligerent side of things and say, actually, after we became independent as a country, the state became independent, wanting to join the Union, expecting it would join the Union, and spent about 9 years just being rejected and kind of humiliated and elbowed aside. So actually, Texans were trying to join the Union before the Union would have us. Which I think puts a different light on the whole thing.
Well, except under Mirabeau Lamar.
That's true.
Who tried to who launched the invasion of New Mexico.
That's kind of, we don't want it anyway.
Well, we don't like to talk about it, but we did invade New Mexico, and unfortunately the column got lost. And actually, as soon as arriving on Santa Fe, they surrendered so they could get a drink of water. It was not our finest moment, but certainly a depth unequaled. Well, really until the 2011 primaries. In any case, we now have come to the final 15 minutes, and I very much want to open this up to Q&A. And it's possible that Erica and I cumulatively have covered everything worth knowing and talking about in Texas. In which case, this is the best panel you're going to see in the coming 3 days. Are there any questions? Anybody from the audience? I mean, Erica, we can talk about anything we want.
There's someone right there.
Is there someone there? Yes, please, right there. Wonderful. Thank you.
Yeah, just quickly, your book arrives at some different conclusions than Gail Collins's book, and I wondered if you would contrast how she approached it differently, because presumably she's also a columnist and also looking for truth. So what did you see, assuming you've looked at her book?
I have looked at the book. Actually, I reviewed it for the New York Times. My sense of the Collins book was that her thesis is that what happens in Texas, first of all, she's much more skeptical of what happens in Texas, but her argument is that what happens here becomes policy in the rest of the country. So my reading of it was that it was maybe, I don't know this to be the case, but it seemed like it was meant to be a book that would apply if Perry became president. So it would say, this guy as governor did this, or the state did this, he's going to do this as president, or if he was the candidate. So, because she talks about how previous Texas politicians have done things as president that they had done previously as governor of Texas. Beyond that, I mean, I think this is actually a more widespread view, though, that the state is so big that its influence is disproportionate, and that we distribute our textbooks around the country, and that we kind of warp the entire national debate. I don't think it's really true, really fair. I mean, if we have a reform in Texas, like the Right on Crime initiative that's come out of this foundation, other states may adopt it if it's a good idea, or if we're, creating a big market, we might start something. Or if we have an innovation like shale gas, that's going to be picked up by other states too, but we don't have any unusual constitutional power to make other states do what we do because we want them to do it. It just seems kind of a little bit overwrought to me in that way.
That was very diplomatic. Very good. For those of you who don't know, Gail Collins writes for a local Northeastern newspaper, whose name I forget. Any other? Pardon me?
Question.
Yes, sir. Please.
We can talk about football. I'll save that question for later. How many hands did it take to catch a football pass during a game? And this is what this convention is all about, and I'll explain it, even if there's some Aggies here. What I'd like for you to address is a fundamental issue that needs to be included in the conference, and I'm addressing it now. What is the story as far as Texas is concerned, comparing it with other states in relation to the way we tax property, the property tax system? I have a document I'm going to give to both of you that will explain in detail what the real story of beaver pond taxation is in Texas now. It will also lead you to what we need to do to level that lake in Texas.
We'd be happy to look at it.
Thank you
Yes,
very
sir.
much.
Yeah, thank you very much.
Let me
Definitely.
respond
Go
to
ahead.
the tax question. I think we're one of only 4 states that doesn't have a state income tax, which means that inevitably we're going to, and despite how relatively light the tax burden is in the state, with no income tax, you're going to put a lot of weight on other tax streams, which for Texas is sales tax and property tax. It's one of the highest property tax burdens in the country. But that's almost inevitable given that there is no income tax at all. So the question of tax reform is one you'll probably hear about quite a bit in the next 2 days because the foundation's been focusing on it. I won't comment on that beyond saying that it would be difficult to change the tax structure here fundamentally because it would require constitutional amendments that would be difficult, I think, to get through. So, and
Any other questions? Yes, so,
the mic's over there.
oh, sorry, we have a gentleman here and then back, and then the back. Yes, sir.
Thanks. First, a kiddie thing on property taxes. I appreciate the concern, but having moved here from Illinois, Texans don't know anything about property taxes. My property taxes are 1/3 in Texas what they were in Illinois. But my actual question is comparing to your book, the positives of Texas. When we look at our comparable megastates, California, Illinois, and New York, there's almost nothing positive said about Texas, and I lived in Illinois till 2 years ago. Whether it's our education system, where we clearly outperform the Illinois education system by a mile, or California's.
Oh, they produce presidents in Illinois.
Yeah. Thanks for kicking me when I'm down. But what I'm saying is, do you recognize when you're doing your research, there's almost nothing written in any of the media in those states that would be positive about Texas. How does your book somehow get other people to realize, I mean, Illinois is about to default. It will be the first state to default. They literally can no longer pay bills,
Yeah.
and yet they'll still write something bad about Texas and not even mention that Illinois is bankrupt.
It's this kind of mutual circle of hostilities. I think that Texans will talk about Washington, and then everyone talks about Texas, and then we kind of get bigger and stronger and angrier, and just keep talking how great we are. So maybe there's, I think in general, it's hard for us as Texans to be like, no, really, we're way more awesome than you think, because it doesn't sound, it sounds like we're biased maybe, which of course we are. So the way I tried to get at it in the book was just by saying, this is how we got this way. I mean, just think about the history of the state. Think about how when Edith Wharton's writing about New York, everyone here is riding a donkey, and then for 50 years following that. I mean, just think about how the state has, where it's come from, where it's going, and what the experience has been in the state. And my thinking was that would help kind of put it in context and maybe rehabilitate or remediate some of the distance between us and the rest of the country. I mean, and I think every state has great things about it and bad things about it. I'm happy to praise any state that is doing a good job with something, and also to critique any state that's doing a bad job with something. So.
A question in the back, the gentleman back there.
Yeah, this is a less serious question, but in terms of Fehrenbach's book and Mitscher's book,
Yes.
there's this concept of Texans really ambivalent about what other people think about us. I wonder from your perspective, how deep does that permeate the culture as a whole? In other words, we really don't give a damn what other people think about us.
Yeah.
So how much of that did you find? Just your thoughts on that, thanks.
I think it's generally true that we don't. There's occasionally you get a little bit of almost a reactionary strain, or I don't think you get self-pity, but you get this sort of sense of we're being unfairly judged, a little bit of aggrievement. I don't think it's a strong enough sense to move state policy. I don't think we're reactionary. And I guess actually the evidence point I would cite in that is that I think after Bush became president, the next session, 2001, you saw a lot of changes in the legislature that were pretty bipartisan moves. That was the tuition bill year, it was the hate crimes bill year, it was the flexible permitting year, it was the indigent defense year. So I think that might have been in response to, we were getting a lot of national attention and a lot of national critique, and then the ledge came back and perhaps having registered some of those critiques, did some things that, it was a relatively calm and moderate session, so.
Josiah, I believe the gentleman with the laptop back there had a question, but behind the table, yes.
Yeah, with Obama being reelected now, over the next few years, one thing we're going to start to see in a lot of these big dying blue states is the moment when they finally really run out of money. And they're going to go really, really badly broke in a way that they haven't yet. And when that happens, I think as people continue to move to Texas, as businesses continue to flock here, as capital continues to flock here, there is going to be a much more intense demonization campaign against Texas coming from Obama and coming from the national media that will make anything we've seen up to this point look like child's play. And my question is, how successful do you think that will be in the rest of the country?
If I may,
Sure.
just to preface this, fortunately we have a member of the national media here who's written quite a lovely book about Texas. So if I could start with that defense, and Erica, you can add whatever you'd like.
I would say, I don't know if it'll be demonization of Texas per se. I don't think Obama actually demonizes Texas. I think it'll be there'll be a pretty fraught debate about the red state, blue state model, because it seems like maybe the red state model is what a lot of states have had, and we continue to have, and the blue state model, broadly defined, is what a lot of states, maybe what the federal policy is moving towards, even as a lot of big states are struggling with challenges arising from that bigger state system. I think that, again, going back to the point about the metric for Texas is Texas, we should keep in mind that the opportunity cost of having the kind of belligerent attitude that we have is that we're not making a case for ourselves that other states or the country as a whole relates to necessarily or easily. I mean, it's, I think it creates an opportunity for us to say, in terms that other states understand, this is what works about the state, it's worked for us. If you want to try this kind of approach, you're free to try it in your state. If you don't want to, you don't have to. And I think for some states, the blue state model makes more sense if they're more affluent states to begin with, for example. So my hope is that it's not going to be as polarized as you're worried it will be. If it is, I think we should respond to any hostilities with love.
How much time do we have left? Do we have time for one more question? Or we?
Okay.
Sorry, 2 minutes? We have 10 minutes. We have plenty more time. Any other questions? Yes, so you in the back first, and then you right here, sir.
I'm one of those braggadocio native Texans that you spoke to earlier, but my concern is, as the gentleman in the back brought up, we have a large number of progressive thinkers moving into the state because in Texas jargon, they pooped in their nest with their voting record. So now they've come here and they're pooping in ours because they brought their voting philosophy with them. And they're coming in large numbers. And at some point, they may outnumber us. What are your thoughts on that?
Well, I guess I'm an Air Force brat, so I might count as one of the new people in the state. I was born in Illinois, but I think of San Antonio as my hometown. I think it's fine for us to have a spectrum of opinion in the state. I think that any system has to justify itself by appealing to our reason and our values. And if people come here and see that, I mean, if people want to make a case for a change in the state and the voters of the state approve that change, I would have the confidence to say it's a worthwhile change to try. We can always change back later on. There also is the chance that people who move to the state are going to adopt some of the Texan way of thinking and start modulating some of their opinions based on that experience.
Just out of curiosity, can I get a show of hands on the folks who are immigrants to Texas? I'll even raise my hand because even though I'm a native Texan, I want to show solidarity. That's wonderful. I mean, thank you all for coming here, and thank you for being Texans.
We're actually
really.
we're part of
There's
the miracle,
nothing we
so
love more.
all
Exactly. Isn't it beautiful?
Yeah.
It's kind of nice. Please.
I think in general it's an advantage of us as a state that we have had so much experience dealing with change. I think we know how to deal with change. I mean, economic change, political change, any kind of change you can think of. I think we know how to look into that with courage and optimism. So.
This gentleman right here had a question, and then I'm going to
I have more of a statement,
Sure.
but I think it was really interesting what you were mentioning earlier about the secession movement across the country, and with Texas kind of leading. But I think that underneath this desire to succeed is really, I think there's something much more fundamental that Americans, and particularly Texans, are feeling, and that's a threat to their freedoms. It's a threat to the Constitution. Just last week, there was an op-ed piece in the New York Times about how we need to rethink the Constitution.
Sure.
Yeah. That's what
Yeah.
And I happen to work for the National Rifle Association, so our focus is the Second Amendment. But let me just tell you, it's just not the Second Amendment. Every one of our 10 Bill of Rights are under assault. And I think when people, and one of the things that I see as a problem right now is the media, the general national media does not respect that. I think here in Texas it still does. But that's my comment. Thank you.
Well, I'm a First Amendment zealot myself, so I can relate to the idea of wanting to be a zealot about the Constitution. I thought that op-ed you mentioned was, I didn't like it either. I think part of the magnificence of our Constitution in the United States is its flexibility, its elasticity, the fact that every generation approaches it anew and while hewing to the principles, can use it or adapt it if it's needed to respond to changing circumstance. I think it's a glorious document and one that has made us the country we are.
There's a question. Yes, sir. Right there, Mr. Groveman.
I hail from Connecticut, came down here 4 years ago, and I'm a Texan by choice. I'm not an immigrant. And I like to say that because when I met people the first time coming down here, I'd mention from Connecticut, and they'd kind of look at me somewhat skeptical, wondering what I was doing down here, et cetera. When I told them I was a Texan by choice who happened to come from Connecticut, the reaction was a very different and very warm one and a welcoming one. And I can tell you that most of the people coming down here who I know, this is an anecdotal set, not a statistically correct set necessarily, are here because they've chosen to escape other parts of the United States where freedom is not being embraced.
I think we have a gentleman in the back, and that's probably about the time we have, and then Erica, you and I will wrap up after that. So, last question.
I've been in Texas for 32 years, more than half of my life, and I was wondering if, from your research, did you notice what I've come to realize from my experience, that there's a huge difference between way some people in Texas, particularly people that are born in Texas and raised here, lived here all their life, the way they see Texas and the way Texas actually is, the reality of it. A big disconnect. Did you see that, or did you write about that in your book?
Well, I guess to me, I can't really say I saw it firsthand because I was born in Illinois. I grew up moving from state to state, but I think that Texas is really noticeable, and it's related to the kind of outside state pride that Texans by choice are kind of celebrated as like some of the best Texans. It's a state where, from the beginning, I mean, you think about the heroes of the Revolution, none of them were from Texas. Even the Tejanos were not from Texas as a political entity. So it's really, I mean, which is kind of true of the United States too, but it's definitely true in Texas. I mean, this is a state where you can come here as an adult or as a kid and be just as much part of it as someone who was born here and has family going back 8 generations, which is, to me, I think, wonderful.
All right, well, thank you. I have one last question before we go, and I have saved the most difficult one for last. And this is the question that really is in the hearts of all Texans, and I think it's appropriate that you, as the author of a Texas book, are asked. But you're uniquely qualified to answer it. Is Texas, and I've wrestled with this for quite some time, is Texas a great state, or is it the greatest state?
I don't have to wrestle. I would say the greatest.
Very good. Thank you all. Erica Greeter. Now, before you go, feel free to accost Erica with further questions, which I'm now volunteering her for. Her book, Big, Hot, Cheap, and Right, on sale April 23rd. When is it for pre-orders on Amazon?
I learned yesterday you can already pre-order it.
You can pre-order this book right now. So go do that, because that will generate more press and more people will talk and think about Texas. Thank you all very much. We'll reconvene here at 11:15 sharp to talk to Ben Domenech about media and culture. Thank you very much.
Thank you.